This is lesson 29 on personnel and duties. We've made it into chapter 4 in your book, and this lesson will cover pages 161 through 166. So on page 161 in your book, we see the practice of pharmacy rule. This is rule 27.1001. What this rule does is it sets forth the functions that only a pharmacist or a registered intern acting under the supervision of a pharmacist may perform. And you can see some of those are listed on the slide for you there. They're being responsible for the controlled substance inventory. It doesn't mean they have to take the inventory, but they're responsible for it. Receiving verbal prescriptions, interpreting prescriptions, consulting with the prescriber about prescriptions, any type of professional communication, making the final check of the prescription, providing patient counseling, and so forth. The reason this is important because you have to remember that duties that can only be performed by a pharmacist are those duties that a pharmacy technician cannot perform. Now, the one about the final check of the prescription is a little bit interesting. The rule kind of contradicts itself a little bit because at the beginning of the rule it says these are duties or functions that a pharmacist or an intern can perform. But when you get to G, it actually says only a pharmacist may perform the final check. So because it says only a pharmacist there, I interpret that to mean that really an intern cannot make the final check of a prescription. Only a pharmacist can do that, even though the beginning of that rule says these are functions that either one can do. Since that one specifically says only a pharmacist can do this, I think that was the intent of that particular section. Now, on page 162, we have a different rule, and this is 27.420, and the rule is entitled Delegable and Non-Delegable Duties. And it's a completely different rule, but it also lists duties that cannot be delegated to a pharmacy technician. So in essence, it's doing the same thing that the previous rule did, but it's in a different section. But like what I try to do is bring these rules together because they're really talking about the same topic. You can see here, things that only pharmacists can perform. Receiving verbal prescriptions, that was in the other rule as well. Interpreting the prescriptions, conduct final verification, engaging in prospective drug review, monitoring prescription usage, all the professional functions of a pharmacist, even preparing a copy or reading a prescription for purposes of a transfer, which is kind of an interesting one. Patient counseling, which we talked about before. Letter J is an interesting one. Receiving therapy or blood product procedures in a nuclear pharmacy. That one's interesting because most, and we'll cover this in the nuclear pharmacy section, but I wanted to mention it here since it is listed. Why is it only saying blood product procedures? The reason for that, or therapy, the reason for that is most prescriptions in a nuclear pharmacy are for diagnostic purposes. And if they're for diagnostic purposes, there's an exception for nuclear pharmacies that does allow pharmacy technicians to take verbal orders for those. But if it's a therapeutic or blood product prescription in a nuclear pharmacy, then it's treated more like a regular prescription in a community pharmacy, under which only a pharmacist can take that verbal order. And we'll cover that again in the nuclear pharmacy section. So you'll see my study tip on the bottom of 162 is that this rule, 27.420, and another rule, 27.103, which also talks about duties, together describe all those duties that only a pharmacist can do. So what duties can a pharmacy technician actually do? What duties can be delegated to a pharmacy technician? Well, as we mentioned previously, this rule 27.420, it's called the delegable and non-delegable duty rules, and it still lists all the duties that only a pharmacist can perform. And it used to have a list of duties that could be delegated to a pharmacy technician, but those have been removed from the rule. So basically what it says now is you can delegate any duty or function that doesn't require the use in the pharmacy technician's own judgment and discretion. In other words, there's no independent professional judgment required. Anything that requires professional judgment would have to be done by a pharmacist. And obviously, all those things that are listed as duties that are not delegable, those things that only a pharmacist can do, are the ones that cannot be delegated to a pharmacy technician. But there is no longer a list of the specific duties that can be delegated to a pharmacy technician. Now in the middle of 163, you see another rule, Rule 27.4001, that just says when you're delegating tasks to a pharmacy technician, a pharmacist cannot delegate more tasks than you can personally supervise. And then for some reason, it still says that you can delegate those non-discretionary tasks, referencing the other rule, to a registered pharmacy technician. Now, I put in the note there, it references that other rule where there used to be a list of non-delegable tasks. That list no longer exists. So this rule probably needs to be updated. This rule also goes into what supervision is required of pharmacy technicians when you do delegate tasks to pharmacy technicians. And what it says is you have to have direct supervision by a pharmacist. Now, what is direct supervision? If you turn over to page 164, this gets a little bit tricky, but it sounds like direct supervision is really strict. But then as you read the definitions, you find out it's pretty flexible, because direct supervision is defined as supervision by a pharmacist who is readily and immediately available while the tasks are being performed. So it doesn't mean you have to have eyes on the pharmacy technician. You're just readily and immediately available. And then it goes on to define what readily and immediately available is. And it gives you options if you're in the same location as a technician, or if you're using technology and you're not at the same location. So as you read these rules together and read these definitions together, it actually authorizes remote supervision of pharmacy technicians, including from work at home or other locations, which comes in really handy when people started working from home during the pandemic and so forth. So, a lot of states haven't gone this far to allow remote supervision of pharmacy technicians, but I think when you read these definitions of direct supervision and readily and immediately available, Florida has taken that extra step to allow remote supervision of pharmacy technicians. Okay, so when we're supervising pharmacy technicians, we have to talk about the pharmacy technician ratio. Now, many states have done away with pharmacy technician ratios. Instead of doing away with it, Florida has just made it complicated. There's not one ratio. The rules and the laws reference many ratios. In fact, the rule at first says that the ratio is 1 pharmacist to 1 technician. I don't know why that's still even listed, because that's no longer the ratio, but it's still in there, because what it says is the ratio is 1 to 1 unless specifically authorized to do it to expand the ratio. Well, it has been specifically authorized for every pharmacy to expand the ratio, so I don't know why they didn't change that language. The basic ratio is 6 to 1 on the bottom of page 164, because what it says is any pharmacy or pharmacist may allow a supervision ratio of up to 6 registered pharmacy technicians to 1 pharmacist. The only exception there is if the pharmacy technicians are engaged in sterile compounding, and then we get a stricter ratio, and that ratio is on the top of page 165, and you can see when any pharmacist or pharmacy technician is engaged in sterile compounding, the ratio becomes a 3 to 1 ratio. Now you'll see in the study tip that this has been interpreted to say that if you've got separate areas of the pharmacy, then you could have a 3 to 1 ratio in the sterile compounding area, and the rest of the pharmacy could have 6 to 1 ratio for the other pharmacy functions. But any sterile compounding has to be limited to a 3 to 1 ratio. In addition to that, there is an 8 to 1 ratio if the pharmacy is not dispensing drugs. So if you have a pharmacy that, let's say, is a call center and they're not actually dispensing drugs, or a section of the pharmacy where there's no dispensing taking place, then that area can have an 8-to-1 pharmacy ratio. To me, when you get to 6-to-1s and 8-to-1 ratios, I don't really understand what the purpose of the ratio is, but this is the rules in Florida, and this is what you need to know. It is interesting, in the middle of page 165, you'll see there, determining the supervision ratio has to be made by the prescription department manager or the consultant pharmacist of record if it's an institutional pharmacy, and it says no other person should interfere with that decision. So, I mean, that's trying to get to the point that they don't want the corporate management people telling the pharmacist managers how to staff their pharmacies. I'm not sure how much help that really is, but at least the board is trying to give the pharmacist control over that particular situation. Okay, while we're talking about duties and by different types of personnel, we should touch on pharmacy interns as well, starting on the bottom of page 165. And it just says there that an intern can't perform acts of filling a prescription or compounding or dispensing unless they're under the direct and immediate supervision of a Florida licensed pharmacist. What this means is that interns can really perform any function that a pharmacist can perform, I think, except for that final check of the prescription based on that language we talked about earlier. And we'll see when we talk about immunizations, the way the law was written on immunizations, it expanded the authority of pharmacists to immunize patients 7 years of age or for flu vaccine and flu vaccine only, but the language did not include pharmacy interns in that particular law. So that's one other area I think that where it's something that an intern could not do that a pharmacist could do. And again, we'll cover that when we do immunizations. And you'll see a study tip on page 166 that there really is no ratio of interns to pharmacists like we have for pharmacy technicians to pharmacists. However, we did mention one earlier in the previous lesson. Remember, if it's a foreign pharmacy graduate intern, there is that 1-to-1 ratio. All right, so that is it for the introductory and first lesson in chapter 4. We'll start up again on page 166 with lesson number 30.